The wind swept across the plains with a hollow sound, carrying with it the smell of dust, pine, and the faint echo of coyotes in the distance. Out here, under the wide and endless skies of the old American frontier, silence had a way of growing heavier with each passing year. On a lonely stretch of land stood a weathered ranch house, its wood faded by time, its fences leaning with age. Inside that house lived a man whose life had been shaped by solitude, hard work, and an unspoken longing he dared not admit aloud. Folks in the nearby town only ever called him the rancher, a man who, despite his 40 years on this earth, carried himself with the uneasiness of someone who had never truly been close to anyone. He had worked this land since boyhood, building fences, tending cattle, patching roofs, and fixing wagons. His hands bore the calluses of decades of labor, his back the weight of a life with no one to share it with. He had no children, no wife, and no memory of tender laughter at his table. He had been raised to believe a man's duty was to work and endure, yet as he grew older, the emptiness crept into his evenings like a draft through the cracks of the old cabin walls. Neighbors whispered about him, sometimes kindly, sometimes cruelly. Hard worker, but strange, some said. Others muttered that a man of his age, still untouched by the warmth of a woman, must be cursed by fate or too timid to face life's pleasures. He never answered them. He just kept his head down, fed his cattle, and kept his eyes on the horizon. But on nights when the fire glowed low and the stars lit the sky like silver pinpricks, he would allow his heart to wander. He dreamed of voices filling the silence, of soft footsteps echoing in his cabin, of a smile cast his way not out of pity, but out of care. Still, dreams were all they were. In this harsh country, survival didn't leave room for such luxuries. Until one fateful night, when 3 shadows appeared on the road leading to his land, carrying with them a storm of change he could never have imagined. The night was colder than usual, the kind that made would pop and crackle in the fireplace. He was stacking firewood when he saw them in the distance. 3 women, wrapped in worn shawls, their boots heavy with dust, their faces carrying both weariness and defiance. Travelers weren't unusual, but women together, without a wagon or men to guard them, were. As they drew closer, the flicker of the moon revealed their painted lips and tired eyes, their dresses more suited for saloons than for the wilderness. He knew at once what they were, though he had never dared step foot into the brothel houses himself. These were women of the trade, women who survived not by plowing fields or herding cattle, but by selling comfort in towns where men lined up with, coin in hand. When they reached his porch, they spoke plain. They had been turned out of a nearby settlement after a brawl broke out in the gambling hall. The sheriff had ordered them gone, and with nowhere else to go, they had wandered until their feet brought them here. The rancher stood awkwardly in the doorway, clutching his lantern, torn between suspicion and a stirring inside him he couldn't quite name. One of the women, tall and fair with her arms crossed against the cold, looked him square in the eyes and said they weren't asking for much, just a roof for the night, a fire, and maybe a bite to eat. Another, with raven-dark hair and a tired smile, added that they had something to offer in return. Not money, for they had none, but themselves. Shelter for warmth, and warmth for shelter. His heart pounded in his chest, though his face betrayed nothing. For 40 years, he had lived a life untouched by such things. He had heard stories of men in town boasting of brothel visits, but he had never dared. Not out of pride, but out of fear that he wouldn't know what to do, that he would be mocked, that he would fail at something so many men seemed to take for granted. Now here they were, standing on his porch, offering him what he had secretly longed for, but never sought out. The firelight flickered on their faces, and he felt caught between the safety of the life he had always known and the dangerous, intoxicating unknown that now stood before him. He could hear his own breath in the silence, the crack of firewood still fresh in his ears. His mind swirled with questions. Could he trust them? Were they truly seeking shelter? Or was there a hidden snare in their sudden arrival? And more pressing still, he even had the courage to let them in, to step across the line between his lonely, guarded life and the world of intimacy he had always feared. Their eyes were on him, waiting, almost daring him to decide. One of them shifted closer, her shawl slipping slightly from her shoulder, revealing skin that caught the glow of the fire. The rancher's hand tightened on the lantern. For the first time in years, the silence inside him felt louder than the coyotes outside. The women's offer lingered in the air, heavier than the cold. His heart wanted to say yes, to finally surrender to the part of himself he had buried for so long. Yet something deep in his chest whispered caution that nothing in this land came without a price. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust, and stepped back into the doorway, torn between slamming it shut or opening it wider. The choice he made tonight could change everything, whether for better or worse. He could not yet know, and so on that cold frontier night, with 3 women of the brothel world standing before him and the weight of 40 lonely years pressing down on his soul, the rancher faced a moment that would alter the course of his life forever. He drew in a slow breath, the fire at his back casting shadows across the walls. And just as he began to speak, the wind outside howled through the cracks of the cabin as though the land itself was listening for his answer. The rancher's hand lingered on the doorframe as the 3 women stood before him, their eyes flickering in the firelight. He felt the weight of their presence pressing against the silence that had lived inside his cabin for so many years. When he finally stepped aside, they entered with a mix of hesitation and quiet relief. The fair-haired one moved first, her arms folded tight against her chest, as if she still expected to be turned away. The dark-haired one followed, her steps slow and deliberate, and the third, draped in beads and cloth that looked out of place against the rough wood walls, cast her eyes about the cabin with a guarded expression. They brought with them the smell of the road, smoke and dust, mingling with the faint sweetness of perfume worn down by travel. Inside, the fire glowed against the stone hearth, casting shadows across the room. The rancher busied himself with the woodpile, though his hands shook slightly as he stacked the logs. He kept his back to them longer than he needed to, steadying himself. The women murmured softly, settling into the room as if testing the air, measuring whether this man could be trusted. At last he turned, his lantern still in hand, and asked the simple question that weighed on him more than any chore he had ever done. "Where are you headed?" The tall one, the fair-haired woman, looked at him with a faint smirk, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "Wherever there's a roof, and a man kind enough not to throw stones at us." Her words carried no apology, it's only a tired honesty. The rancher nodded, though his heart was tangled in unease. He knew what they were, knew how men in town whispered about brothel women and the kind of lives they lived. He had always avoided that world, not because of disdain, but because he never thought himself fit for it. He had grown used to being unseen, a background figure in the dance of life. Yet now, with these women under his roof, he felt the stillness of his existence breaking in ways he could not name. They took seats where they could, one on a stool, another on the edge of his bed, and the third crouched near the fire to warm her hands. Their eyes roamed his cabin's parched shelves with chipped dishes, a rifle resting against the wall, an old rocking chair carved by his father. The place spoke of years lived in work and silence, of a man who had poured himself into tending land rather than hearts. The dark-haired woman finally spoke, her voice softer, almost kind. "This house feels empty, like it's been waiting." He felt his cheeks warm but said nothing. Instead, he ladled stew from the pot simmering on the fire, offering them bowls as best as he could. They ate without complaint, though their glances at him carried a mix of gratitude and curiosity. As the hours passed, the story of their journey began to unfold in fragments. They had been in a mining town not far from here, where fortunes were won and lost in the clang of pickaxes and the shuffle of cards at gambling tables. Trouble had come when a drunken fight broke out at the saloon. Some blamed the women for stirring it, though by their telling it was just another night when men's tempers boiled over. The sheriff, wanting to clean up the place before it grew into full chaos, had ordered them out. With little choice, they had taken to the road. It wasn't the first time they had been run out of a town, and likely wouldn't be the last. Their trade kept them moving like tumbleweed, never truly rooted, never welcomed for long. But tonight, they had found themselves on the rancher's porch, staring at the one man who might give them more than a cold shoulder. The rancher listened, though his own mind was caught in a quiet storm. He found himself studying them, not with lust, but with a strange mix of wonder and fear. They were bold in ways he had never been, carrying themselves with an air of survival, born of hardship. They had known rejection and scorn, yet still stood with their heads high. He had known rejection too, but of a quieter kind, the kind that came from being invisible. From living a life no one looked too closely at. In a way, their worlds were not so different, though separated by choices and circumstance. As night deepened, the unease inside him grew. The thought of 3 brothel women staying under his roof was enough to stir gossip for miles, if word ever spread. He pictured the sheriff's stern gaze, the way townsfolk would whisper with narrowed eyes. Yet the greater weight came from within. They had spoken their offer plainly shelter in exchange for themselves. It was a bargain most men would have seized without hesitation, but he felt torn by it. He had dreamed of closeness, of affection, but not like this. Not as a trade, not with the fear of being seen as a fool lingering in his chest. Still, he could not deny the stirrings in his heart. He noticed the way the fair-haired woman's laughter, rare as it was, softened the edge of the room. He caught the way the dark-haired one's voice carried warmth even in the coldest words. And the quiet one, adorned in beads and cloth, held his gaze longer than the others, as if studying him in return. Each of them carried their own secrets, and in that cabin, secrets weighed heavier than the firewood stacked by the hearth. The night wore on, and the wind outside rattled the shutters. The women grew weary, their shoulders slumping with the kind of tiredness that comes only after days on the road. The rancher laid out blankets on the floor, though they eyed the bed with quiet amusement. He tried to sleep in his chair, staring at the fire until his eyelids grew heavy, but rest would not come. His mind swirled with the questions that refused to let go. Why had fate brought them here, to him of all people? What would happen when morning came? And most of all, did he have the courage to face what was being offered, or would he retreat into the safety of his silence once more? Somewhere in the dark, the quiet woman spoke softly, her voice carrying across the stillness. "You're different from the men we've known." He stirred, glancing at her silhouette in the firelight. She said no more, but her words hung in the air, heavier than any promise. He wondered if she saw through him. She could sense the truth he had carried all his life, that at 40 years old, he had never been with a woman. He prayed they wouldn't see the shame of it written across his face. To them, perhaps it was strange. To him, it was a weight that had followed him into every dawn and every dusk. The fire cracked, sending sparks into the chimney. Outside, the coyotes called again, a reminder that the world was wide and merciless. Yet inside that cabin, the world felt smaller, more dangerous in its own way. The women had found warmth for the night, but their presence had stirred something restless in the rancher's soul. He felt as if he stood at the edge of a canyon, the ground beneath him ready to give way, and he could not yet see if the fall would bring ruin or salvation. When dawn finally brushed pale light against the windows, the rancher rose stiffly from his chair. The women stirred, stretching, their faces softer in the morning glow. He busied himself with chores, tending the fire, fetching water, anything to keep his hands moving. Yet even as the sun rose higher, the questions of the night lingered, unanswered. He could not shake the feeling that his life, once so steady and predictable, had been set on a path he could no longer control. Their presence had already begun to unravel the silence he had built, and the days ahead promised only more uncertainty. As he stepped outside to feed the animals, the cold air biting at his face, he heard laughter drift from the cabin behind him. It was light, fleeting, but enough to make his chest ache with something unfamiliar. He paused, hand resting on the fence post, staring out at the endless plains. The land stretched on as it always had, but for the first time in years. He felt that the loneliness pressing in on him was beginning to crack. Yet with that crack came danger, for nothing in the old frontier came without a price. And he feared the cost of what had just begun. Morning gave the land a thin gold edge, and the rancher worked through the chill with a purpose he had not felt in years. He forked hay to the horses and checked the pump by the well, while his mind drew quiet circles around the same questions. The 3 women were inside his cabin, heating coffee and wiping dust from their boots. He found himself listening for the soft scrape of their steps, as if those sounds could explain why his life had turned like a wagon at a wagonetta. Crossroads by noon, they were out with him in the yard. The fair-haired one picked up a broom and swept the porch with a stiff kind of pride. The dark-haired one mended a ripped sleeve with careful stitches, and the quiet one followed the rancher to the barn, helping him patch a stall door that had loosened in last week's gusts. She did not talk much, yet her silence felt different from his. Hers was watchful, like someone listening for a sound only she could hear. When the rancher asked if she had worked with horses before, she gave a small nod and placed a palm on the mare's neck. The mare, who tended to nip, dropped her head. It was a small thing, but it surprised him. They ate a simple lunch under the eaves while wind carried the scent of sage across the yard. Between bites, the fair-haired woman spoke about the mining town they had left. She spoke of a gambler who ran a crooked table and a barkeep who poured thin whiskey. She mentioned a lawman who liked to look clean and harsh all at once. The dark-haired woman said there had been a rumor circling like a hawk before they were driven out. A stagecoach had been robbed on the Ridge Road, the kind of crime that set towns on edge. Men were searching for who did it. Some fingers had pointed at the brothel, since travelers with coins stopped there and word slipped easy. The women denied knowing anything, but fear had spread faster than reason. They had left because the sheriff wanted quiet streets, and a quick way to get that was to push the noise away. The rancher listened with a slow nod, though a weight settled in his gut. If a stagecoach robbery was fresh on men's minds, strangers on a lonely ranch would draw attention. He looked out to the road that cut across his property and imagined riders coming around the cottonwoods. He felt the old instinct to duck his head and keep to himself. Only now, keeping to himself also meant keeping them safe, at least for the time being. He told them they could stay until they had strength enough to move on. The fair-haired one lifted her chin and thanked him without a smile. The dark-haired one gave him a look that softened the sharp edges in the air. The quiet one watched the road longer than he did. That night in the cabin, a different kind of tension filled the room. He felt it in his shoulders every time he moved past them. In the careful way he placed a cup on the table. In the warm space near the hearth, where the dark-haired woman braided her hair and spoke low with the others. The offer they had made on the porch hung between them, not spoken again, but not gone. The rancher swept the floor, counted nails in his mind, held two small tasks like a man steadying himself in a river current. He told himself he would decide nothing until he could look each day in the face and not be ruled by fear. A day later, he hitched the wagon and took the weak, fair-haired woman with him into town for supplies. The choice was practical. He needed a partner to handle the list while he loaded sacks of feed. And she carried herself with a kind of sharp readiness that would keep conversation short. On the ride down the rutted road, she kept her eyes on the distance and asked brief questions about his ranch. How many head? How long the drought had lasted? What kind of neighbors he had? He answered carefully. He felt strange beside her, like a boy playing at driving a wagon he had driven every week for 20 years. When they rolled into town, the street glared with dust and sunlight. The blacksmith's hammer rang. A pair of children ran past, waving willow sticks like toy rifles. They tied the team outside the general store. Inside, the storekeeper eyed the woman at his side and made his voice loud and slow as if testing the rancher's nerve. The rancher held his list steady and bought flour, coffee, salt, and lamp oil. He added a bolt of cloth at the fair-haired woman's nod, and for reasons he could not name, he paid for a ribbon too. The storekeeper's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, the rancher found the sheriff leaning in a pool of shade. The lawman wore a short coat and a badge that caught the light. He had the type of face that looked like it had never been young. He tipped his hat to the fair-haired woman, then looked at the rancher as if trying to read a brand on a cow that refused to stand still, without a word. About who the woman was? He began talking about the stagecoach robbery. 3 riders, maybe 4. A strong box gone. 1 guard hurt. He asked if the rancher had seen strangers on his road. The rancher kept his voice even and said the plains were wide and the wind erased tracks, which was true. The sheriff let the moment stretch, then touched the brim of his hat again and stepped away with a reminder that the law was watching. The roads close. On the way home, The fair-haired woman sat quiet, her hands folding and unfolding on her lap. She broke the silence at the edge of the rancher's property. She said the sheriff in the mining town favored easy answers. Out. And that lawmen sometimes decided who was guilty first, then went looking for proof later. She told the rancher that running had kept them alive more than once. He heard no pride in her voice, only a plain statement about the world as she had learned it. He asked if she knew anything about the robbery. She tilted her head toward the crags to the north. She said those rocks were full of hiding places. Then she asked if he trusted his neighbors. He said trust was like rain in this country, rare and precious. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Back at the cabin, the quiet woman had spent the day in the barn. She had pushed the cows to fresh grass and checked the tack without being asked. The dark-haired woman had cleaned the table and lined up utensils like soldiers. The rancher felt a strange jolt at seeing his house ordered by other hands. It looked like a place someone might want to return to. They ate stew again, this time with small bites of salt pork. And after the meal, the quiet woman brought out a small satchel he had not seen before. She opened it without flourish and laid its contents on the table. A locket, a folded paper, and a ring that had seen better years. The locket held a faded picture of a child. The paper was a bill of sale from a long-closed dress shop in a town far to the west. The ring had been squeezed to fit a different finger once upon a time. The three women looked at those items with the stillness of a prayer. The rancher understood without words that these were the sum of a life carried from place to place. It made him think of his own life's sum, and how it would fit into a single pocket if he had to run. As days slid one into the next, a new pattern took shape. The women worked as if repayment were a duty written into the walls. The fair-haired one tended the garden patch and proved she could shoot straighter than the rancher had guessed. The dark-haired one fixed a window latch, sorted the pantry, and hummed songs from towns they had left behind. The quiet one and the rancher grew used to walking the fence line together. Sometimes she spoke about horses she had known, but more often she pointed to tracks. Sign of where coyotes crossed, or where a pair of boots had come off the road to the fence and then turned back. She found those boot prints on the third morning. He stared at them long enough to feel the hum of danger in his bones. That afternoon, the rancher saddled up and rode the ridge alone, scanning for dust from riders. He saw none, but he did find the charred remains of a campfire near the creek bed. It was still warm under a layer of ash. He nudged it with a stick and found the corner of an envelope. The postmark was from a town 2 counties over. The name written across it had been burned away. He slipped it into his coat and turned his horse toward home with a taste of iron in his mouth. The subplots of their lives wove tighter. The dark-haired woman grew friendly with his nearest neighbor, a widow who kept bees and traded jars of honey for help mending fences. The two women exchanged quiet smiles and small gifts at the gate. But the neighbor's teenage boy watched the ranch with a gaze that carried more question than respect. The fair-haired one practiced with the rifle when she thought no one was looking. She missed her first few shots, got angry, then steadied her breathing until the tin can jumped at the shot. She looked at the can as if daring it to move again. The quiet woman spent evenings sketching with a stub of charcoal on brown paper. Drawing the house as if she needed to make proof it stood in the world. The rancher's inner conflict deepened. He felt the pull of desire, but also the pull of a different longing, one with no market price. He wanted to be seen as a man and not as a stop on a road. He wanted to build trust that did not end at sunrise. He feared speaking those wants aloud because words changed things, and once spoken, they could never be put back. He sensed that the women understood more than he said. When the fair-haired one met his eyes, he saw in hers a challenge to be brave enough to say what he wanted. When the dark-haired one laughed at his shy joke, he felt invited to sit closer to the fire. When the quiet one walked the fence with him, he felt a kind of peace he had not known since childhood. The world beyond the ranch did not quiet down. One evening a rider came hard down the road, then slowed when he saw the cabin light. He did not approach. He turned his horse and vanished into the ravine. The next day, a notice went up in town that the stagecoach company had posted a reward. The sheriff spoke to half the county by week's end. A baker in town swore he saw 3 riders crossing the flats after midnight. A drifter bragged at the saloon that he knew where the strongbox was buried. No one could prove anything, yet the stories grew. The rancher kept away from town after that. But the news found its way along fence lines and through kitchen doors just the same. Suspense ripened like a storm cloud. One night, while the 4 of them sat close to the hearth, the wind dropped and the land went too still. The dog the neighbor boy sometimes let roam through the fields started barking in the distance, then went quiet in a way that made the skin at the back of the rancher's neck prickle. The quiet woman set down her charcoal. The fair-haired one reached for the rifle without being told. The dark-haired one closed the locket with a click that sounded far too loud. They waited, counting heartbeats. A knock came at the door that was not a knock so much as the edge of a glove against wood. When the rancher opened it a crack, he found the sheriff standing there with 2 deputies and a lantern that made their shadows long across the yard. The sheriff said he was making a friendly call. He asked if he could step inside and warm his hands. The rancher felt every muscle in his body clench, and he told himself to breathe because a lawman who smelled fear would follow it like a hound. They came in, boots scraping, eyes roaming across the room in ways that were not friendly at all. The sheriff saw the women and took in the scene like a ledger. He made a thin remark about the company a lonely rancher kept when the nights grew cold. The fair-haired woman's mouth tightened. The dark-haired one sat still, hands folded on her lap. The quiet one leaned against the hearth, with a face as blank as stone. The sheriff asked questions that sounded simple. Where had the women been last week? Who had passed on the road since they arrived? Whether the rancher had heard riders at night? Whether he had found anything unusual while riding his range? The rancher felt the weight of the charred envelope in his coat pocket and knew that truth could pull him under like a river. He answered with care, sticking to what he could swear to with a clean conscience while giving them no new road to travel. A deputy lifted the lid on the stew pot without asking and made a joking comment that was not a joke. The sheriff stepped close to the quiet woman and studied her face as if trying to remember where he had seen it. For a breath, the rancher thought the lawman would pull the locket from her hand. He did not. Instead, he turned to the rancher and said he would be riding past again soon. Others might ride past too. He advised the rancher to keep his eyes open. The law was patient, he said, and right had a way of floating to the top. When they were gone, the rancher barred the door. No one spoke for a long time. The fair-haired woman finally said the sheriff had been in that mining town 2 nights before they were run out. She said he had a way of showing up where rumors got loud. The dark-haired woman whispered that she had seen one of the deputies in the gambling hall on the night of the brawl. The quiet woman said nothing. She looked at the door as if she could see through it to the road. Then she looked at the rancher, and he understood that she wanted to tell him something she had not told anyone. Before she could speak, smoke began to curl under the door. Not thick at first, more like a question. The scent was sharp and wrong. The rancher grabbed the water bucket and flung the door wide. Flames licked the edge of the haystack by the barn, running fast in the wind. He shouted to the women to keep low and bring more water. Sparks flew like angry bees as the fire took to the dry grass near the corral. The rancher fought the blaze with all the strength his body had learned from years of stubborn work. The women formed a line with buckets drawn from the well, faces set, skirts catching ash. The fair-haired woman kept her aim steady. The dark-haired one moved like she had been doing this all her life. The quiet one turned and looked toward the ridge. For a second, her face changed. Grief or anger, the rancher could not tell. She started to run toward the hill as if she had recognized a shape against the stars. He called for her to stop, but his voice was swallowed by the crackle and roar. The fire leaped to the fence rails like it had been waiting for a chance. Horses screamed in the corral. The rancher cut the rope and drove them toward the creek, praying they would find water. When he turned back, the quiet woman was gone from the corridor of light. The fair-haired one shouted that she had seen a figure on the ridge. The dark-haired one cried that the locket had fallen in the dirt. The smoke turned the night into a world of ghosts. By the time they beat the flames back from the barn, the wind had changed. The ranch held, blackened but standing. Sparks still glowed in the weeds like eyes. The rancher stood with the two women and tried to catch his breath. In the thin quiet that followed disaster, he listened hard for the sound of footsteps returning from the ridge. None came. The road answered with nothing but the whisper of cooling ash. The sheriff's lantern was nowhere in sight, yet the feeling of being watched did not leave. The rancher felt the envelope in his pocket like a stone, and knew that whatever truth it held might now be tied to the woman who had vanished into the dark. The night accepted their fear without giving anything back. The horses huddled near the creek. The corral rails steamed. Somewhere on the ridge, a rock shifted and slid. The rancher picked up the fallen locket and closed his hand around it. With a promise, he spoke only to himself. He would find the quiet woman. He would follow the ridge at dawn. He would learn who had set fire to his land and why. But when he lifted his eyes to the long black line of the horizon, he saw the faint shape of riders holding still against the sky. And he understood that dawn would bring more than answers. It would bring others who wanted the same truth for reasons he could not yet see. The night after the fire seemed to stretch longer than any the rancher could remember. He kept watch by the door, his hand never far from the rifle, while the fair-haired woman sat near the table, sharpening a small knife with slow, careful strokes. The dark-haired woman had taken to pacing the cabin, restless as a caged animal, her eyes darting to the window every few minutes as though she expected the sheriff, or worse, to ride straight up the road. The quiet woman was still gone, and her absence left the cabin feeling hollow. Her satchel with the locket and papers remained where she had laid it before, though now the locket was clutched in the rancher's pocket. Smoke still lingered over the fields, rising in thin gray threads. The rancher saddled his horse, telling the two women he would search the ridge for their missing companion. The fair-haired woman wanted to come, but he shook his head. If more riders circled the land, someone had to stay behind to guard the cabin. Her jaw tightened, but she gave a curt nod, her hand resting on the rifle stock. The dark-haired woman whispered that he should not trust the sheriff if they crossed paths. She said men like that carried secrets thicker than the dust on their boots. He didn't answer. He only rode out, eyes fixed on the blackened trail of ash that led toward the hills. The ridge looked different by morning light, full of deep shadows that clung to rocks like old stains. The rancher dismounted and followed boot prints pressed into the dirt, some sharp, some already blurred by wind. They led up a narrow path, and the higher he climbed, the stronger the sense grew that he was walking into a snare. A crow called from a dead branch, and then silence took over. At the top he found a clearing where the fire had not touched. The remains of another campfire lay there, this one more recent, ashes still holding a faint warmth. Beside it, pressed into the earth, was a mark of a boot heel larger than any he had seen near his ranch. He crouched to study it when a faint sound carried through the brush. He turned quick, rifle half raised, and saw the quiet woman emerge. She looked pale, her hair tangled, but her eyes were clear. She said nothing at first, only handed him a scrap of paper she had been holding tight in her fist. It was torn from the burned envelope he had hidden in his coat. The name scrawled on it matched the sheriff's own. The rancher felt the ground tilt under him. The stagecoach robbery, the missing strongbox, the sudden suspicion falling on the women, it all smelled different now. He asked her where she had found it. She said she had followed a rider up here after the fire, had seen him stirring the ashes of the camp. She said the rider wore the sheriff's coat. Her voice was steady but low, as though she feared the rocks themselves might be listening. Before the rancher could press her further, the sound of horses came from below, more than one, moving fast. He motioned for her to keep low, and together they slipped back through the brush. From the ridge they saw 3 riders crossing the field toward the ranch, dust curling behind them like smoke. The fair-haired woman stood on the porch, rifle raised, while the dark-haired one carried a bucket of water to the barn, glancing over her shoulder with quick jerks of her head. The rancher's gut twisted. If those riders meant trouble, his land would become a trap. He led the quiet woman down the ridge at a run, the rifle heavy in his hands and his breath sharp in his throat. By the time they reached the cabin, the riders had already dismounted. They were not deputies, but hard-eyed men, the kind who looked like they belonged more to the trail than to any town. One wore a red bandana tied at his neck, Another had a scar that cut deep across his jaw, and the third carried himself with a calm that was worse than menace. They spoke in low tones with the fair-haired woman, who kept her rifle pointed steady, though her shoulders were stiff with tension. The dark-haired woman stood close behind her, clutching that small knife she had been sharpening. When the rancher stepped forward, the men turned their eyes to him all at once. It felt like being pinned under the weight of storm clouds, the scarred man asked if he had found anything unusual near the ridge. His voice was rough, but there was something testing in it, like he already knew the answer. The rancher said nothing about the paper or the sheriff's name. He only said the ridge was full of old campfires and wind. The man with the red bandana spat in the dirt and said the strongbox had to be somewhere close. He claimed they were sent to track it, and that strangers hiding on a ranch only raised questions. His hand never left the grip of his revolver. The calm one studied the women with a gaze that lingered too long. He said the law could not be trusted, and neither could women who ran from the law. His words hung heavy, leaving no room for ease. The quiet woman stepped forward then, surprising them all. She said the robbery was not their doing, that the sheriff had a hand in it, and that men like him used others as smoke to cover their own fire. The scarred man's jaw tightened at that. And for a flicker of a moment the rancher thought he might know some truth in her words. But the calm one cut her off with a shake of his head. He said truth didn't matter when a reward was on the table. The only thing that mattered was who could claim it first. The silence that followed was broken only by the restless snort of the horses tied to the post. Tension thickened as the sun climbed higher. The rancher's thoughts raced. If the sheriff was tangled in the robbery, then these men could be his allies or his enemies. Either way, they were dangerous. He glanced at the fair-haired woman, whose grip on the rifle had not wavered. The dark-haired woman's knife glinted at her side. The quiet woman stood tall, despite the danger, her eyes never leaving the men. The rancher felt the weight of their trust pressing down on him, and with it, the knowledge that any wrong word could set off a fight none of them might survive. The riders finally said they would return by nightfall, and if answers were not given by then, they would take what they needed. They mounted up and rode off, dust trailing behind like a warning. The rancher stood still until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he turned to the women, his voice low but firm. He said they had little time, and that the storm around them was closing in fast. The fair-haired woman muttered that she had warned him running only bought so much safety. The dark-haired one asked if he trusted her enough to listen to her plan. The quiet woman whispered that the ridge still held more proof, but it would come at great risk. They all looked to him, waiting, as if his choice now bound them all together. That night the sky was heavy with stars, sharp and cold, and every sound carried across the plain like a bell. The rancher moved along the fence line, checking shadows, knowing the riders could return at any moment. The fair-haired woman sat on the porch with the rifle across her knees, her eyes locked on the road. The dark-haired ones stayed inside, packing what little they might need if flight became their only option. The quiet woman sketched in the dirt with a stick, drawing out a map of where she had seen the sheriff's coat near the camp. Her hand trembled, but her voice was steady. She said the truth was close, and that if they dared to uncover it, the lawman himself might be dragged down. The night dragged on, every minute wound tight, like a rope pulled to breaking. The horses shifted nervously in the corral, picking up scents the rancher could not. The wind carried faint echoes, sometimes like laughter, sometimes like boots on gravel, though when he turned, there was only emptiness. The women grew restless. The fair-haired one muttered about being hunted like animals. The dark-haired one whispered prayers he could not catch. The quiet one stayed close to him, her eyes always searching the horizon. He could feel the unspoken question in her silence, whether he had the strength to see this through when the dawn came and the storm broke for real. Before midnight, the glow of lanterns appeared on the far side of the ridge. Not one, but several, weaving like fireflies. Hoofbeats followed, steady and growing louder. The rancher's heart pounded as he raised the rifle, and he saw the fair-haired woman do the same. The dark-haired one gripped her knife with white knuckles. The quiet woman whispered his name, her voice soft but urgent, as if trying to tether him to the ground before the world shattered. The sound of the riders grew until it filled the night. Then, just as the first lantern came into view at the edge of the yard, the sheriff's voice rang out, calm and sharp. Carrying across the darkness, he said he had come for the truth, and that anyone standing in his way had better be ready to face it. The rancher felt the weight of the paper in his coat pocket, the locket in his hand, and the trust of the women around him. The night was no longer just about survival. It was about what kind of man he would be when the fire reached its peak. And as the lantern light spilled across the yard, turning the night into a stage, he knew the moment of reckoning was upon them, as though the outcome was still hidden in the shadows. Top of form, bottom of form. The sheriff's lantern light threw long shadows across the ranch yard, painting the ground in gold and black. The rancher stood steady, rifle grip tight, the women close by, their breaths sharp in the still air. More riders fanned out behind the sheriff, their faces half hidden by hats pulled low. The tension that had been building for days now settled heavy, pressing against every heart in that yard. It was the moment everything had been leading to. The sheriff's voice carried again, smooth but edged with steel, saying he had come for the truth and nothing less. The rancher stepped forward, boots crunching on the dirt. He drew the torn paper from his coat pocket and held it high enough for the lantern light to catch. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. The women stiffened, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. The rancher spoke clear and plain, his voice rough from years of silence, but steady as stone. He said, "The robbery, the fire." The suspicion hanging over the women, all of it, pointed to a single name, the name on the paper, the sheriff. The riders shifted uneasily at that, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground as if they too felt the tremor beneath the words. The sheriff laughed, though the sound rang hollow. He called it a lie, a trick spun by desperate souls hiding from justice. Yet his hand moved to his belt, resting on the revolver as though he knew the truth had been cornered. The quiet woman stepped forward then, her voice firm, as she told of seeing him at the ridge, stirring ashes, guarding what remained of the strongbox. She spoke with a conviction that made even the hard-eyed riders exchange wary glances. The fair-haired woman raised her rifle higher, her gaze fixed, daring any of the men to deny what was now laid bare. The dark-haired woman muttered under her breath, "Not prayers this time, but curses meant for men who use the law to cover their sins." The sheriff tried again to twist the tale, claiming the women had lured the rancher into their lies. But the scarred man among the riders cut him off. He said too many things never sat right. Too many signs pointed elsewhere. He had followed orders, but he was no fool. The calm man beside him gave a slow nod, his hand slipping from the grip of his revolver. The sheriff's face tightened, his calm cracking as he realized the loyalty he counted on was slipping away. He shouted that they were all turning traitor, but his voice wavered. In that waver, the rancher saw the truth plain as day. What followed was quick, as most reckonings are. The sheriff drew his gun, but before he could fire, the scarred man struck his hand aside, sending the shot wide into the dirt. The rancher raised his rifle but held steady, unwilling to spill blood unless forced. The quiet woman's words rang out, telling the riders to choose which side of the fire they stood on. For a moment it seemed all would collapse into chaos. But then the sheriff was on the ground, his gun kicked away, his power drained with it. The men who had ridden with him stepped back, their silence enough to seal his fate. The rancher bound the sheriff's hands with rope, the same way a man would tie a wild horse to keep it from harming others. The women stood together, their eyes fierce but tired, like storms passing after long nights. The riders left at dawn, carrying the sheriff to face justice in town. Though whether justice there would be fair was a question none could answer. Still, the grip of fear eased with their departure, leaving the ranch yard quiet again, save for the call of birds greeting the sun. In the days that followed, the rancher rebuilt the part of the barn that had burned, with the women working beside him. The fair-haired woman hauled beams as if born to the task. The dark-haired one tended the horses, whispering to them until they calmed. The quiet woman helped mend fences, her eyes always scanning the horizon, as though she carried within her the memory of danger that could return at any moment. Together they turned the charred ruin into strength, proof that even fire could not break what had been built with honest hands. Word spread through the valley of what had happened. Some folks whispered that the rancher had taken up with women of ill repute. others that he had stood against a crooked lawman and saved his land. For the first time in years, the rancher did not flinch from the whispers. He carried himself with a steadiness born of knowing he had faced down more than loneliness. He had faced down fear itself. The women, once looked at as outcasts, now found in his ranch a place where judgment did not rule them. Slowly, neighbors who had turned their eyes away before now came with offers of trade, of help, even of friendship. Each woman found her path in the wake of those nights. The fair-haired one chose to stay longer, saying she had grown weary of the brothel life and longed for something steadier. She spoke of maybe raising chickens, of planting a garden where ash once lay. The dark-haired one left after a few weeks, her restless spirit pulling her toward the road. She hugged the rancher before she went, telling him she would not forget the shelter he gave her when the world turned cold. The quiet woman lingered longest, her bond with the rancher deepening in silence more than in words. They shared evenings on the porch, watching the sky blaze with colors before night fell, their shoulders sometimes brushing as if to remind each other they were no longer alone. The sheriff's downfall left its mark on the town. Folks began to question the weight of authority, to see that law without honesty was only another mask for greed. The stagecoach line replaced him with a man known for fairness, and slowly trust crept back into the community. The rancher became a figure of quiet respect, not for wealth or show, but for standing firm when shadows tried to claim his land. The women's names no longer carried only whispers of their past work, but also of courage and survival. As the season turned, the rancher found himself changed. For 40 years he had carried the label of solitude, a man apart, untouched by warmth. But now he knew what it meant to share a table, to hear laughter in the cabin, to feel another's hand steady his when the storm pressed hardest. He still worked the land, still rose with the sun and mended fences, but his days were no longer measured only in chores. They were measured in the company he had once thought beyond his reach. Looking back, he saw how chance had brought 3 women to his door on a cold night, asking only for shelter. From that moment, his world had shifted. Trouble had followed them, yes, but so had the chance for change. Together they had faced fire, lies, and the weight of judgment, and together they had endured. In the end, the ranch was not just a place of soil and wood, it had become a haven where truth had been fought for and won. When the quiet woman finally chose to stay for good, it was not with grand promises or words. It was in the way she planted a row of wildflowers along the fence line, and the way she moved her few belongings into the cabin without asking. The rancher watched her and understood. Sometimes a man's life turns not on thunder or fire, but on small, steady steps that lead him from loneliness into something brighter. Years later, folks would still tell the story of the rancher who had lived alone until fate placed 3 women on his porch. They spoke of the sheriff who fell to his own corruption, of the fire that nearly claimed the barn, and of the quiet strength that held it all together. Some told it as a tale of justice, others as a story of redemption. But at its heart it remained what it had always been, the story of people, flawed and weary, who found in each other the courage to endure. The rancher himself did not think of it as legend. To him it was simply life, hard and true, where the soil gave what a man worked for, and where company once found was more precious than gold. As he sat on his porch in the evenings, the fields stretching wide and the wildflowers catching the breeze, he knew the years of silence had led him here, not to riches, not to glory, but to the simple gift of no longer being alone, and that, to him, was worth more than anything the world could ever whisper.